Welcome to panel session TP6. Let me get this right here. T6Pb, the title of which is Urban Governance and Housing Cost, Gouvernance, urbaine et coût de logement. And I am jumping in as panel chair. Hopefully I will be sharing this with Claude and Ngomsi, who is on screen, but we're not sure he's with us quite yet. So I'm gonna just kind of jump in and take over a little bit. We have got three presenters in this panel. Just, sorry about this. The first will be Alan Kane of the Development Workshop in Angola. Alan is actually the thematic chair for this whole theme. And Alan will be presenting a paper called Housing for Whom? Building African Cities on Chinese Credit, but Who Gets Left Behind? Our second presenter today will be Benoit Mugue from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon. And he will be speaking presumably in French, Autoconstruction ou logement affordable au Cameroun, financement, bonne pratique et lessons apprises. So auto construction and affordable housing in Cameroon, financing, best practices and lessons learned. And then our third presenter today will be Hanan Zhang from Shandong Jiangsu University in China, who is delivering a paper he's co-authored with Hu Zhuao. And the title of that paper will be Analysis of Spatial Patterns of Housing Price in Shijiazhuang, based on geostatistical analysis. So welcome, everybody. Michelle, are all three of the presentations pre-recorded?
Yes, I have all the pre-recordings.
Okay, great. So with everyone's permission, then we'll go right into the pre-recordings, and we'll start with Alan's presentation.
When the Angolan Civil War ended 20 years ago, the country was left with destroyed infrastructure, a divided civil society, broken families, and shattered cities. The National Plan for Urbanization and Housing was one of Angola's flagship programs for post-war reconstruction. Development Workshop and civil society partners are monitoring Angola's implementation of the new urban agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, number 11. The housing sector was officially prioritized with the country's 2009 National Urbanization and Housing Program that aimed to build 1 million units and reduce housing deficits by 50%, to be financed from 5% of Angola's petroleum income and Chinese credit lines. This presentation assesses the outcomes of who benefited from the National Urban Program and its sub-programs. We compare the state-supported program with the social production of housing that received no state support and examine the option of slum upgrading. Rural to urban migration was fueled through the 4 decades of conflict leading to the peace accords in 2002. An enormous pent-up demand for housing and urban basic services built up over 40 years of conflict. Angola has become one of Africa's fastest urbanizing countries, with more than 67% of population living in cities today. Luanda has an average annual growth rate of almost 6%. The Angolan economy was one of Africa's fastest growing, increasing at tenfold in the decade after the war, but declined in recent years due to the fall of oil prices. In 2009, the government estimated that the real shortfall of housing was almost 2 million units, and that 90% of urban housing was substandard and needed substantial investment to upgrade it to acceptable living standards. The National Program for Urbanization and Housing was launched in 2009 to address the post-war urban crisis and to promote urban social development, including the renewal of slums. Key players tasked to deliver within the National Urban Plan of delivering social housing were the state, taking on 11.5% of the million houses targeted, the private sector responsible for delivering 12%, cooperatives 8%, and assisted owner builders the remaining 68.5%. These photographs are illustrations of the key players involved with the National Urban Housing Program: the public housing sector, the private sector, housing cooperatives, and state-directed self-help building. Development Workshop has been working with the UN Habitat and the National Institute for Urban Planning since 2006 in implementing Angola's National Urban Observatory that monitored the implementation of the Habitat Agenda. DW's approach to co-production of data involves teams from local municipalities, universities, and community associations who are trained in using participatory GIS mapping tools. Data is collected by community groups on a regular basis for monitoring changes of local poverty indicators. Community co-produced data is used in advocating in the municipal forums and municipal councils. Poverty scoring is used as a way of ranking families, employing a tool available to non-specialists to quickly compute the likelihood of a family living below the poverty line on a scale of 1 to 100. Co-produced data can measure the local impacts of public investments over time. This is a map showing poverty indicators across Luanda. The dark red and orange indicators show the greatest poverty area in the inner city slums. More than half of Luanda's population still lives in informal settlements called museks. An adequate monitoring framework must go beyond just tracking the delivery of housing by the state. The official government approach to slum removal or renewal is a strategy called requalification. But in practice, in Luanda, this involves forced removals of long-term residents, the demolition of their housing, relocating families on the city periphery, and appropriation of their land for new housing or commercial development. Favela Bairro program that has been piloted in 2 districts in Luanda, involving in situ upgrading of urban infrastructure service and vulnerable families. The findings from our search are projected in this table. The players in the new urban, in the national urban policy, the state, private sector, cooperative, and owner builders are indicated, and their targets and their actual performance are shown in this graphic. The state public housing, mass housing program delivered 155.2% of their target, so they greatly exceeded their projected target. The private sector, on the other hand, has only achieved 32.2% of the target deliverables. Cooperative housing, even poorer at 13%, and directed owner-built housing has only managed to distribute land to about 15% of their target group, little information available about progress on house construction in this sector. The total housing units produced by the National Urban Housing Program was 236,767 units. And that's really only a little over 24% of the targeted million houses. At the same time, owner builders without support from the state have built almost 220,000 units. The bottom graphic on this slide shows the beneficiaries of the different components of the National Housing Program. We can see that the private sector had delivered housing only for the upper middle class and elite section of the population. The state subsidized program has served the middle and upper middle class. And in situ upgrading or informal sector housing has been left to serve the vulnerable and poor sections of the population. Key findings from the research. The state has exceeded its target, but served the upper and upper middle class section of the population. The private sector served only the elite end of the market, financed partly by state and public-private partnerships. The cooperative sector performed badly, but the major failure was the lack of support for owner builders, who were responsible for delivering 2/3 of the National Urban Housing Program, but delivered only a small percentage of this. The National Urban Program has delivered 236,000 odd housing units, while the social production of housing by families themselves, without support from the state, has built 218,418 units over the same time. Therefore, through social production by families themselves, those families have delivered almost the same volume of sectors of the economy put together. Recommendations from the study. With a weak culture of evaluation of project performance, Angola has failed to draw on lessons for future programs. The National Urban Program's over-reliance on conventional housing has not addressed the housing needs of the poor. The poor's needs are best served by support for social production of housing and upgrading of informal settlements. The National Urban Program's reliance on foreign contractors contributed to Angola's $43 billion debt and was a missed opportunity to generate local employment and invest in local building trades. The simplification of land administration and the approval of housing finance legislation remains important reforms still to be put in place. Angola's pent-up demand for housing means that the real estate market could still provide a driver for future economic growth. Monitoring needs to go beyond tracking housing delivery in just numbers and answer the question about who benefits and who gets left behind.
Thank you so much, Alan. Kind of a bleak picture of what's going on in Angola, but as you suggest, there's a lot of opportunity there for using housing construction to kind of stimulate the economy as well as to address housing shortages. So we'll come back to it in our discussion portion. All right, we will now move to our second presentation. And our second presentation, I'm sorry, guys, I'm between 3 or 4 different files here. Our second presentation will be by Benoit Magui from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon. And this is the self-construction of housing, affordable housing in Cameroon, subtitled Financing Best Practices and Lessons Learned. I think Benoit is going to deliver this address in French. And with that, we will ask Michelle to play this presentation.
Chaleureuse salutations à tous les participants à ICCCASU 4. Je dois vous entretenir sur l'autoconstruction ou logement abordable au Cameroun, financement, bonnes pratiques et leçons apprises. Je suis bien Benoît Magui, Université de Yaoundé 1 au Cameroun. À guise d'introduction, je signale que l'autoconstruction est une stratégie mise en œuvre par les habitants moins nantis des pays en voie de développement en général et les Camerounais pauvres en particulier pour bâtir leur ville et leur village avec des moyens de bord au mépris de la réglementation. Cette autoconstruction est une réplique populaire à la pauvreté et traduit l'ingéniosité des populations face à l'incapacité de l'État de leur offrir un logement décent ou de les encadrer en vue de l'occupation ordonnée des espaces urbains. Expansion de l'autoconstruction en milieu urbain dans mon pays. L'autoconstruction est très répandue dans les pays en voie de développement, en particulier l'Afrique, dont le Cameroun. Elle fait appel surtout à une main-d'œuvre familiale ou à des artisans non ou peu qualifiés. Il s'agit d'un défi de respect de la réglementation, de l'application des normes et même de la technologie dans la construction. Au début de leur aventure en milieu urbain, tous les jeunes, généralement démunis, se lancent dans l'autoconstruction. Ils sont poussés par des motifs multiples, voire quelques-uns. Il y a par exemple la recherche de l'économie d'habitation par l'acquisition d'un chez-soi. Ces jeunes veulent également se débarrasser d'un loyer qui est un véritable fardeau au budget familial. Ils veulent également montrer leur réussite dans la vie par la possession de leur propre logement. Ils veulent améliorer également leur revenu personnel par l'offre des chambres en location. Il y a également une démonstration de la fierté personnelle ou ostentatoire. Il y a également le coût relativement bas des sites d'accueil de ces constructions, constitués de marécages et des pentes inconstructibles. Ces causes sont vraiment multiples, je ne peux pas me mettre à signaler le tout, mais il faut aussi parler de cette ingéniosité personnelle du promoteur. Face à la pauvreté persistante au Cameroun, l'autoconstruction sans nul doute touche le plus grand nombre de citadins à qui de bâtir leur maison d'habitation. Elle concerne près de 90% des résidents dans les villes et puis dans les villages. Elle s'adapte à toutes les formes de construction, ne fait appel qu'au corps de métier qui étale au grand jour l'incompétence ou l'ignorance des promoteurs de construction. Quels sont les matériaux qui sont utilisés dans l'autoconstruction? Ces matériaux sont variés et relèvent d'une double provenance. Des matériaux locaux existent et accouplés à des matériaux locaux existent et des matériaux exotiques également. Dans le sud du pays, on note une évolution remarquable dans les matériaux utilisés. Progressivement, on est passé des matériaux légers tels que les planches non éclatées, qu'on appelait les carabotes, et qu'on trouvait généralement dans la région du littoral, à des pierres taillées de la région du nord-ouest, des briques adobe de la région de l'ouest, ou bien de la terre de grille dans la région du centre. Donc on est passé de là aux matériaux faits aujourd'hui à base de ciment en plus. qui sont dans la partie septentrionale du Cameroun. Les maisons traditionnelles autoconstruites appelées sarrés subsistent. Il s'agit de cases rondes, voûtées, bâties à l'aide des matériaux localement produits tels que la terre pétrie, le puisé, la paille. Dans l'ensemble du pays, il faut le dire, la terre revêt une grande importance dans l'autoconstruction et contribue à la création des quartiers précaires, mal assainis, sous-équipés et sous-intégrés qui nécessitent une requalification ou une restructuration. Ce type de quartier représente 12% de la superficie des métropoles Yaoundé et la prolifération des quartiers précaires urbains constitue une niche de construction. Au Cameroun, coexiste un système foncier dualiste où les autochtones jouent un rôle déterminant dans l'occupation des sols. Non titulaires patentés des terrains qu'ils ont hérités des parents, ils sont très actifs dans des sites déclarés non aedificandi ou dans les franges urbaines où se négocie l'extension des villes. Ce système favorise l'occupation anarchique du sol par des habitations précaires autoconstruites conformément à un plan architectural qui se conçoit au cours de l'édification par le promoteur. Source de financement de l'autoconstruction. Il faut déjà le dire que la construction au Cameroun est dominée par 3 organismes. La Maïtu, la SIC et le Crédit foncier. Ce dernier organisme s'efforce à financer l'habitat sous toutes ses formes. Malheureusement, ses capacités d'intervention sont très limitées. C'est pourquoi les autoconstructeurs font appel à d'autres sources. Parmi ces sources, on peut citer la banque, la tontine, la coopérative d'habitat, les aides familiales, les prêts informels, les prêts usuraires, les épargnes personnelles dans les maisons. Alors, autoconstruction, quelles sont les pratiques courantes et les leçons apprises de ce type d'éducation de la ville? L'autoconstruction présente plusieurs enjeux. Elle magnifie la réponse à l'expansion de la pauvreté et la fuite incontrôlée des populations dans les centres urbains. Il s'agit de la démonstration ostentatoire de la réussite en ville. Il s'agit également d'une réponse à la faillite de l'État, je vous ai dit, qui est incapable d'offrir des logements décents à ses citoyens. Il s'agit de la traduction de la volonté des néo-citadins de se soustraire de l'embrigade des tuteurs. Il s'agit également de la concrétisation de la volonté d'un néo-citadin d'avoir sa propre maison, un chez-soi, dit-on. L'autoconstruction met en relief l'ingéniosité des citadins dans la recherche de solutions à leurs problèmes de logement. Ils construisent des maisons de leurs rêves à l'aide des matériaux disponibles, souvent moins chers, mais savamment mis en œuvre. Dans la perspective d'un développement durable, les autorités camerounaises doivent mettre en place des moyens pour régulariser le foncier dans les quartiers autoconstruits, qui sont d'ailleurs très précaires, afin d'encourager la diversification de l'habitat dans les zones. À titre de conclusion, je dois relever ceci, c'est que l'autoconstruction apparaît comme une activité peu employée par les autorités gestionnaires des villes, mais une activité en vogue au sein des populations citadines. Il s'agit d'un palliatif des carences de l'État camerounais qui a fallu dans la recherche de solutions au logement décent de ces populations. Dans la réalité, l'autoconstruction produit dans chaque ville, dans chaque congrès, un tas important de logements de qualité variée. Leur durabilité dépend essentiellement d'un double facteur, la mise en œuvre et la qualité des matériaux. Dans le changement de la perception de l'autoconstruction, les pouvoirs publics doivent jouer un rôle essentiel, dévolu au mérite dans l'encadrement des promoteurs immobiliers non professionnels. Voilà ce que je tenais absolument à partager avec vous. Et par la suite, je laisse une bibliographie sous ce PowerPoint qui peut aider certaines personnes qui s'intéressent à l'autoconstruction. Merci pour votre attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Benoit. I think we all had some difficulty with the audio on that, so we were having a lot of trouble hearing it. But as you were reading what was on the slides, it was actually quite easy to follow along. So hopefully everyone got the gist of it. Essentially what Benoit presented was a kind of an update on the state of residential construction in Douala and Yaoundé, indicating that the bulk of it is still informal construction, largely due to lack of financing that's available. So it actually very much resonates with Alan's presentation on what's going on in Angola. So we'll come back to both of those. Michelle, there were lots of messages in the room saying, please turn up the volume. I don't know if that was possible or not. Can you, do you want to comment?
Yeah, no, because of the volume was in the video, I couldn't do anything.
Okay.
I'm very sorry for this.
Not a problem. I had the volume turned way up on my computer so I could hear it, but that's good. But again, Benoit, it was a very, very clear presentation and very clearly laid out on the slide. So hopefully a lot of us were able to follow it despite the problems with the sound. Okay, let's move now to our final presentation in this session. And this will be of Hanon Shang from Shandong Jiangsu University in China, who will present an analysis of spatial patterns of housing prices in Shijiazhuang based on geostatistical analysis. So Michelle, if you will get that going for us.
Hello, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Haonan Zhang, and I'm the master of Shandong Jianzhu University in China. My topic today is analysis of spatial pattern of housing price in Shijiazhuang based on geostatistical analysis. This presentation is divided into 5 parts. I want to begin with research problems. Then, I will move on to research methods. After that, we are talking about data description. Next, we are talking about spatial interpolation process. And finally, we will land on spatial pattern of house price and influencing factor. Now, it's the first part, research problem. It includes background, purpose, objective, and problems to be addressed. I'm gonna tell you something about the background. There are 3 main backgrounds. The first one is real estate has long been a pillar industry in China. Those graphs show the importance of real estate in Chinese economy and the contribution of real estate to China's GDP over time. As you can see, the contribution to GDP increases with each year. In particular, it has reached 7.3% in 2020. The second one is in the area of inventory planning. The second-hand housing becomes the main body of real estate market transaction. Second-hand housing has many advantages, attracting the majority of buyers, such as good geographical location, complete surrounding facilities, and high-quality housing security. Therefore, the second-hand housing market continues to heat up. The third one is under the background of new type urbanization. The development of second-tier cities has attracted much attention, and there is a problem here. Is that what is a second-tier city? Second-tier cities are defined as most of them are provincial capital cities, strong cities in eastern regions, or regional central cities in economically developed regions. This map shows some of Chinese second-tier cities. Our study area today, Shijiazhuang, is just a second-tier city. It's here. We have three purposes for this research. The first is give some advices for the government on housing policy. The second is help real estate developers optimize development patterns. The third is provide a reference for residents to purchase real estate. The objective of this research is to describe the spatial distribution of housing price in Shijiazhuang's main urban areas and explore the factors influencing the formation of spatial pattern of housing price. With those objectives, two major questions are asked before we begin our research. Firstly, how to analyze the spatial pattern of house price by creating interpolation math. Then, how to verify the cause of spatial pattern of house price with POI data. Okay, I'd now like to move on to the second part, research methods. In this study, I mainly use three methods. They respectively are global spatial autocorrelation, semi-variogram analysis, and crane interpolation. Global spatial autocorrelation is used to analyze whether the attributes specified in the whole research scope have spatial autocorrelation. Crane interpolation can be carried out only if the attributes of data have spatial autocorrelation. The degree of spatial autocorrelation is usually tested by Moran's I index. Moran's I index was created by Moran. Now let's look at this photo. It looks like a kind old man. The second method is semi-variogram analysis. Why should we do the semi-variogram analysis? Because the crane method can be used for spatial local interpolation analysis only after the corresponding semi-variational function is determined. It can not only describe the structural change of regional variables, but also reveal the randomness of variables. The last but not least is crane interpolation. Crane interpolation uses the structural characteristics of semi-variogram and is a method of unbiased optimal estimation of the value of regional variables in a limited region. In this study, the house price of the unknown space can be calculated by the house price of the non-spatial point. If the house price of the known point at I is xi, then the house price calculation formula of any point x0 on the space can be expressed as the next formula. In the third part, I will introduce the sources and attributes of the data. Firstly, the average second-hand housing price date is in Shijiazhuang in June 2020, which includes district name, latitude and longitude coordinates, and residential housing price. The housing price data come from Fangtianxia official website. A total of 494 residential areas. I should note is that the wireless shops, renting buildings, apartments, and other residential buildings are removed. The POI date information includes POI name, type, latitude, and longitude. By the way, we corrected them in WGS 1984 coordinate system. Then, according to the urban residential area planning and design standards, the POI date is divided into 4 categories. Their basic education, business service, medical health, and financial insurance. The data are from a map. We got it through Python. I'd like you to look at this picture. It shows more detailed classification. Next, I'd like to turn to the fourth part, spatial interpolation process. There are three main steps to this process. First, we need to measure the degree of spatial autocorrelation. Second, we have to do a semi-variogram analysis. Finally, ArcGIS software is used to generate the ordinary crane interpolation graphs. The value of global Morris I is 0.312, as shown in this figure. This result could pass the test with a significance level of 1%. Therefore, it can be concluded that the price of second-hand houses in the central urban area of Shijiazhuang presents an obvious positive spatial autocorrelation and shows the spatial clustering among similar attributes. Take a look at this. It shows anisotropy because the variation of housing price in Shijiazhuang in 4 directions is very obvious. According to the above analysis, the geostatistical analysis module in ArcGIS is used to carry out general crane interpolation. We mix the general crane map and the countermap of Shijiazhuang housing price spatial distribution. In the last part, we will talk about the results of our research. In order to further explore the influencing factors of housing prices, we use ArcGIS software to draw the kernel density analysis map of basic education facilities, commercial service facilities, medical and health facilities, and financial and insurance facilities in the central urban area of Shijiazhuang. Finally, I summarize 3 characteristics of the spatial distribution pattern of housing prices in Shijiazhuang and talk about their influencing factors. The first pattern is from our raw point of view. The spatial distribution pattern of housing price in Shijiazhuang is a single center concentric circular distribution pattern, and the main influencing factor is living element. It includes commercial service facilities, financial and insurance facilities, and medical and health facilities. The second pattern is from the direction. The spatial distribution of housing price has great variability, forming an east-west axis-style development pattern. The formation of this pattern is affected by traffic. The third pattern is from the local space. Shijiazhuang housing price has a clear spatial differentiation. It's affected by land use and policy. Thank you for listening. And then if there are any questions, I would be pleased to answer them. Hello?
Thank you so much, Hanan. Excellent presentation. Yeah, I encourage everyone to participate in the discussion and go ahead and raise their hands. Maybe I can start things off a little bit. I had some thoughts on the overlap between Benoit's presentation and Alan's presentation. And I was going to ask a question here. Alan, both Benoit and Alan really talked about the prevalence, preponderance of self-building. Alan, you began to suggest that in fact, this was something that came up yesterday too, that the sort of bottom-up approach was going to be more effective to deal with housing at least in the short term, than the top-down approach. And even though you suggested that the government did a great job, they essentially addressed a sector which was relatively well monetized already and left the poor behind. My concern about that, the idea of the bottom up, is really the question of the density. I think, part of the problem with which Luanda struggles, and certainly was fortunate enough to visit Yaoundé a few years ago, is massive congestion due to relatively low density development. Alan, the idea of self-building is really essentially limiting density to one or two, or building heights to 1 or 2 stories, and really privileging the kind of single family unit, which really exacerbates the problem of sprawl, which in turn exacerbates the problem of congestion. So the only way to do that is to increase the density. The only way to increase the density is to build multi-unit buildings, and the only way to do that is to have well-capitalized entities that can afford to do that. The other challenge of moving people from self-built to multi-unit is you'd be moving them essentially from the category of squatters to the category of renters, which can be quite difficult because people don't have the wherewithal to meet their rent obligations on a regular basis. So I'm a little confused about the bottom-up approach and what it might mean in terms of sprawl, density, and congestion. Maybe you can weigh in on that.
The main constraint around that actually interferes with the densification of the inner city slums is the fact of lack of tenure security for people living in those areas. In some small areas where tenure security has been achieved, we found rather quickly the property market basically to some extent kicks in, and properties have been purchased and upgraded. It's a gentrification process for sure, but it's a gentrification process in that the existing residents benefit from it. They take the profit. They may move to the periphery. They may move to an apartment, but they profit from the tenure that they have.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the densification of the inner city is natural. It's going to happen if the poor can benefit from the property markets. Basically, it's that debate we had yesterday with that Kesia raised around the vision of financing that is available to the poor, and that's only possible if the poor actually have the rights to the land that they're occupying. So I mean, I think that another, I mean, I didn't go into it in this presentation, but we've been working on with UN Habitat actually on the model of participatory requalification of land, basically of land readjustment, that basically looks at the process of densification of slums in a way that the existing residents benefit through the process. They become stakeholders in a land readjustment program where all of what UN Habitat is promoting is the concept of participatory land readjustment. A traditional model of land readjustment basically benefits the land people with title, but in the slum areas, many of the poor, even in a situation where there is private land ownership, many of the poor are renters, and in a participatory process of land readjustment, the rights of the poor, in terms of renters, also have tenure rights in terms of the tenure doesn't necessarily mean ownership, but it's a right to access to use of the property. So it's a complicated question, but you're right. But in countries with weak governance, the approach that the state takes, basically, in our case in Angola, the high density projects are built on the periphery. I mean, they aren't built in the inner city.
Like you're thinking of Quilamba, for instance.
The Quilamba, both Karim and I showed photos of Quilamba. That's about 30 kilometers out of the city center. And that's where the new high density kind of dormitory cities are being built, which is not a model that it's created all sorts of problems of urban sprawl, basically, due to that kind of model. So
I guess what I'm reacting to a little bit is what seems to be the conclusion that people, and this is what Kessia was saying as well, to some degree, at least I understood, that you can't depend on the government or the private sector to come in and solve this issue, and therefore people have to solve it for themselves. But in some ways, the whole history of self-building in Angola and in Cameroon over the last several decades is actually the result of people solving it for themselves. And it actually, it solves a short-term problem that causes an extremely unsustainable, low-density, sprawling city, which you can't get around very well because the roads are clogged and everybody has to drive to get anywhere. And so you solve one issue, namely housing, and you created another kind of issue, which is congestion and sprawl. So it seems to me a little bit of a catch-22.
Yes, well, that certainly is an important issue. But we in Africa, most countries don't have the kinds of tools, planning tools, and the authority that you would have in China, where the problem has been addressed in a different way. I mean, I think we have a lot to learn from the Chinese experience, and the most important lesson from China, I think, is that the Chinese urban trajectory was based on a lot of trial and error and learning from evaluating projects very quickly and changing policy, adapting to innovation. And I think that's in Africa what we need to be looking at, rather than necessarily taking the models from. I mean, in my presentation, I presented actually the government model was housing finance from Chinese credit lines that brought with it Chinese contractors, etc. And the other two models that I talked about, the requalification, was borrowed from Singapore, a kind of Singapore and Sao Paulo, where this kind of planned urban renewal by appropriating and moving people. And the third model was a model from Rio de Janeiro, the favela bairro model, which is an in situ slum upgrading model, which was, in our research, we demonstrated was much more effective. But in any case, I think the main lesson from my presentation was that these processes need to be evaluated. They need to be evaluated actually as regularly and in a fairly short period of time. It's true. I left a rather gloomy picture at the end of my presentation. You noted that, but we have a new government in Angola that is reforming a lot of these policies, doing a massive decentralization program. And in fact, my organization has been, based on our research, has been basically contracted to do a national evaluation formally and work with the government on developing a new housing policy that will be based on this experience of what was successful and not in the past.
Yeah, it reminds me of the work that David and Itai did, where they were able to actually increase the density in the informal settlements, but set aside about 30% of the land for private sector development, and therefore actually encourage building at higher density in those areas. I was just related to that same question, and I'm just looking if others want to raise their hand, that go forward. But Hanan, when you talked about the POI criteria, you didn't mention, how do I want to say this, accessibility and transportation, which usually has a major impact on the cost or the price of housing. My sense in China is things get built out on the periphery. They sit there at relatively low prices because they're hard to get to and very inconvenient. And then at some point, the municipality takes the money from those land leases and extends the subway line. And once the subway line reaches out there, the prices sort of jump. But you didn't really address accessibility, the ease of getting to that housing. You did show highways. I'm not quite sure highways are what I have in mind. I'm thinking more public transportation or things which operate on dedicated rights of way. Do you want to comment on that? Why that wasn't figured into the POI? Well, that's to Hanan.
Hello.
Yeah. Do you want to turn on your camera?
Oh yeah. And the POI data is from a map in China. It includes the road data and the financial data and the education data. And
no, I guess my question is just, it's one thing to say, okay, a distance from the center, the farther out you are, the less expensive the housing is going to be, because the assumption is that that distance translates into commuting time. But if areas out on the periphery are well connected by subway, then that distance doesn't necessarily translate into commuting time. You can actually get into the center much more quickly on a subway than you could by driving. So I just wondered, I guess you're using data that's established or criteria that are established somewhere else, but I was just wondering a little bit about the role that transportation connections played into housing prices. I only say this because, again, thinking back to Luanda or to Yaoundé, getting around the city is extremely difficult. The congestion is extremely high, and therefore, access to efficient transportation would make a huge difference in terms of the value of housing. I also wanted to observe that, and I see that George has a question, so we'll turn it over to him in a minute. I was also going to observe that the same phenomenon, I know in China, the tendency is for all young people to go to university, get a degree, and then immediately go to the first tier cities. So there's a huge amount of pressure on first tier cities to accommodate all these people. Meanwhile, the second tier cities are trying to keep people at home and are building huge amounts of housing, a lot of which sits vacant for long periods of time. I'm thinking of the big projects in Kunming and obviously in Ordos, which were having trouble attracting people. And I know that the Chinese population is very sensitive to quality of education. So if you put very good schools in an area, people will come. So I was interested to see the role that schools played in the POI data. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that that phenomenon of in Canada, we're actually starting to see a redistribution into quote unquote second tier cities, largely because housing is unaffordable in the larger cities. And also it has to do with retirements and people shifting out of big cities to get better value for their money in smaller towns. So we're seeing a bit of a distribution. Thank you for that. So George, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead and pose it live? If not, I'll go ahead and pose it. Yeah, there you are. And you'll need to unmute yourself. George, you're still muted.
Yeah, I want to find out in terms of what are the risks which they encounter especially with regards to dealing with land matter, because I know very well in Africa, land issue can be it can bring up a lot of, it's quite a very complicated terrain. So I want to find out from you, how do you navigate in terms of the risks which is associated, especially on issues of cultural or traditional leaders, and how do you probably mitigate those risks?
Okay, shall I answer that?
Yes.
At least from Angola's point of view. George, I was noting some of your comments in your presentation about land issues relate very much to a situation where you have private land ownership and you have a private land market in South Africa. Angola is and I guess the similarity with China, but also a number of other African countries as post-socialist countries where land is still a commodity that is technically owned and managed by the state. And the rights that people have are use rights rather than ownership rights. So that's a fundamental challenge, basically, when dealing with land issues. Tenure security can still happen when land is owned by the state if use rights are clear and clearly attributed in terms of use titles, basically. But certainly in our case in Angola, we have maybe 5% of urban land registered and part of the formal cadastre. So, you know, we're dealing with a situation of real weak land rights for the majority of people. Now, this inhibits not only owner builders, but also it interferes with you know, real estate investors who have real challenges in securing land rights and long-term rights that they need to guarantee. I mentioned land readjustment as a interesting model that we piloted a land readjustment project in Wambo, a secondary city in Angola, probably the #2 city, where we used the participatory land readjustment methodology promoted by UN Habitat and other human rights defenders, where all occupants of land have a tenure claim, not just those who have hold title. The requalification model that I mentioned in my presentation is a kind of land readjustment, but without tenure, without participatory, without recognizing tenure rights. And it's really a means of the state and private investors appropriating land of the poor. So land readjustment, if it doesn't include a respect for the rights of occupants, can be used against the interests of the poor.
Alan, to what degree does land readjustment depend on a well-functioning judicial system? And is that an issue in Angola?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for land readjustment to work on a large scale, you need to have, I mean, land rights and the rules of the game have to be clearly articulated. We piloted a project of a few thousand units in a secondary city where we had an innovative local governor who was an engineer, so he was interested in piloting the model. So we used local locally attributed permissions for building, etc., as a pilot. And our idea was to promote the model at the national scale and eventually influence public policy. I mean, for us as a NGO civil society organization, our major purpose in this area is to do research, pilot projects, evaluate them, and use those to influence public policy, because really the state needs to be the mover of these kinds of reforms. And we've been involved for many, many years. And, you know, actually our work has reached the point now where the state is working with us on new policies. So I feel it was a worthwhile. It's a long process, but it has yielded some, and it's in the process of yielding some interesting results. So.
Alan, can I also, okay, I'm just gonna ask one question, then we'll go back to George. The socialization of land, or what you call post-socialist countries like Angola, where the land is generally controlled by the state, that when I think of the way taxation works and the way cities get their money, at least in North America, it's primarily on property taxes. If a city can't tax land, where does it get its revenue?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
It doesn't. It doesn't.
So where does that leave
it depends on,
yeah.
you know, in Angola, it depended on oil income that has dried up. And that is probably the major motor of the reform here in Angola, and possibly why our advocacy and research is being appropriated now by the state, because it makes sense for the new municipalities that are the process of decentralization all over the world. Land value capture finances municipalities. Even we saw the slide from China. Even in China, at the national level, the real estate economy finances what was 7.3% of the national economy. Probably, I'm from memory, I mean, our colleagues can answer this, but I think in municipalities, it's over 50% of the budgets are financed through land value capture, maybe more. So yeah, this is
huge incentive,
why, you know,
for land reform.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm saying about Africa learning from China. It's some of these lessons, rather than necessarily the housing models, you know, the high density housing projects that have been built like Kilamba. What's really interesting for post-socialist countries like Angola, Mozambique, and maybe Tanzania and others, that to look at how land has been used by China, where the state is still a major player in land management, but used in a way for financing
infrastructure,
more inclusive urban infrastructure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to create, when it comes right down to it, a middle class, however sustainable that is in China, we'll see. So George has a question for Haonan. George asks, what advice do you give to governments with regard to second-tier cities? In other words, what could Africa, for instance, learn from China with respect to your experience with second-tier cities? That's to Haonan. Haonan, we don't see you and you're muted.
Hello, can you speak?
Yep, we hear you now.
Okay. I think government have to government have to give the market more freedom.
Have you finished, Alan?
I'm sorry, my English is not very well.
Yeah, I think we're putting you on the spot there. So, yeah, I mean, definitely George, you could talk about this. Alan, you could talk about it. Even Benoit, the tendency for people, rural to urban migration, always to go to quote unquote first tier cities, and to leave the second tier cities kind of high and dry. George, is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, like what I was getting at is, remember, one of the things we want to see from ICCCASU is to guide and assist and support students, especially in their research. And I see in his presentation, one of the things he highlighted as one of the objectives which he wanted to achieve was equally to provide policy advice to the government. So which equally teaching research. So I'm looking towards the end to find out where does he equally provide those advice or policy recommendation. So what I want to advise him is that in the course of his work, he should actually make sure that he achieved that very objective, because in terms of external examination, they will be looking at it. Then the other thing I equally want to guide him is that he should, if you go to section 1.4, his research questions, those statements are not having any question mark. Research questions supposed to have a question mark. So he should take note of it. And I'm equally happy in terms of his problem statement, because why I'm so happy with his problem statement is that he created a very good background in his research by actually mentioning that real estate is equally a pillar, especially in a Chinese economy. So I want him to draw some relevance in terms of the bubble burst in America in 2008. So let him go back and reflect on that particular bubble burst that the whole world economy. So it will help him to build a very strong argument. So these are the few things I want to guide him as a young and upcoming researcher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Great, great. So we have maybe 5 minutes for additional comments. David, do you anything you'd like to say? No. Okay. Good. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity then to thank everyone for 3 very excellent presentations. Oh, David, there you are.
No, thanks, Ben. A thoroughly engaging series of presentations and a fabulously moderated discussion.
Claude did a great job.
Yeah. And, well,
all right, great.
It's a great group. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and this is a group that likes talking to each other, which is good. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to stay on. There are a few more sessions in this theme. Unfortunately, I will be on a train in the not too distant future, so I won't be able to participate further. But Alan, I'm hoping you'll keep your eye on things. So thank you very much, George. Thank you very much, Hanan, and Alan. Of course, thank you very much for an excellent presentation on Rwanda. These issues come over and over and over again. I feel like the more sessions we attend and the more we talk about it, the more clear we are about what the questions are and what the issues are. So it's been really, really helpful for me, certainly speaking for myself. So thank you all very much. Thanks, Kareem, for holding on. And with that, I think I'll bring this session to a close and see you all in the next session.